Okay, so it is my pleasure to be able to provide this presentation on the geoscience workforce about today and future trajectories. I'm Christopher Keene. I'm the Director of Geoscience Profession and Higher Education at the American Geosciences Institute. And this is sort of a summary of a lot of the different work that we do at AGI within the workforce program. And what I hope is also an insight into some of the exciting changes that are coming to the geosciences and some of the challenges that I think as a community we need to be thinking about. I'd like to start by thanking our sponsors, the American Association of Petroleum Geologists and the AAPG Foundation, who are uh, basically are ensuring that we can make this public presentation and make it available to the entire community. So again, thank you to them. So where are we now? This is obviously the key cornerstone. What does the geoscience profession look like today, especially as we sort of are emerging into a sort of the post-pandemic crisis, into whatever that new normal is? So one of the first things I always like to do is make sure people understand who are the working geoscientists, and so many times these conversations are in rooms with a lot of folks with PhDs, but the reality is when we're talking about our discipline, our profession, our community, the majority of folks have terminal masters or terminal bachelor's degrees, and they're out there working. And so that does hopefully provide a little bit of context for the nature and the diversity of the population and their backgrounds that you know are who are our colleagues. Plus, there is a not insignificant chunk who have a terminal degree that's not necessarily in the geosciences, but are functioning and doing and practicing as a geoscientist in various forms. Many of them coming from things like engineering and biology and chemistry, but also finance, actuarial, things like that. So one of the things that we want to look at is sort of the employment and what the size of our population is in the workforce, and it generally bounces between 250,000 and 300,000 working geoscientists in the United States at any time. This is a time series during the course of the pandemic to give folks a sense. If you look right there in early 2021, there's sort of this little bit of a drop. And that was the end of the PPP loans. And, I think a key takeaway for us to understand is that 88% of geoscience employers received some type of government assistance during the pandemic. Most of that in the form of the PPP loans that were protecting employment. The other thing too is you see this sort of undulation that goes on, and that's a artifact of how occupations are counted by the federal government. It's as a person's responsibilities change and evolve, could be seasonal or whatever. Their actual classification can evolve as well. And if you do look there, things like the number of the engineering occupations have been growing quite a bit recently, and I think it's reflecting some of the changes we're seeing in the geosciences. The other thing I just want to point out is that during the pandemic, the effective unemployment rate peaked at about 4% for geoscientists. Traditionally, it runs at about 2%, which is about normal for almost all STEM fields. Which is actually considered a hyperactive labor market. 5% is usually considered a normal churn. So we did very well during the course of the pandemic as a community, all in all. So enrollment is one of those key dynamics within our ecosystem, and it's no secret that enrollments have been declining recently and have continued to decline. Particularly at the undergraduate level, which tends to be very, very sensitive to, I'll say, popular perception, particularly tied to the opportunities in the energy sector. What is sort of concerning, and we're seeing some other areas where this is expressing itself and things like scholarship applications and the like, is we've seen a pretty substantial decline in our graduate enrollments over the last couple of years, probably driven by the pandemic. But these may be permanent changes, or they we'll see over the next couple of years if there's a rebound. As one would expect, degrees awarded tends to be a muted form of the enrollment, and it's no different here. We are seeing a very sharp decrease in the last couple of years on degrees awarded in the geosciences at all levels. Some of that, many students have reported that they had to extend their studies by a year, especially at the graduate level. So this is going to be one of those key questions: is do we see a very strong rebound in 2022, 2023, 2024, back to some of those long-term historical averages? Because for all intent and purposes, our graduate programs have been pretty much running at capacity for the last 40 years. So this is a bit of a shock to the system, and only time will tell. But obviously, in a hyper employment market, reduced number of new graduates is not a good thing for the discipline. I do want to point out, particularly for all the folks that are online like me with more than a couple gray hairs, when we talk about the workforce and sort of the education pathway, things constantly change. What our experiences were, in our education don't necessarily reflect what some of the dynamics are that are today. So a prime example here, we can see that the reliance on master's theses and dissertations has really declined over the last number of years. In the graduate education process, there are different kinds of capstones that these students are doing and aren't necessarily registering what some of us from years of yore would consider our classic output. So it's sort of a cautionary tale. We'll touch on some of those same kinds of it's not your father's Oldsmobile kind of situations that we see emerging. So one of the things we do at AGI is an exit of new graduates in the geosciences, and so the 2020-21 graduates were the last that we have a full analysis on. Say, and it's this professional service sector. Interestingly, we see this year a pretty big jump up in the number of folks being hired by the federal government. There has been a lot of retirements, particularly in the technician level, and we're seeing a lot of the bachelor's graduates taking on those jobs in particular. So when we look at the master's graduates, this is where we're seeing a lot of dynamic change. Traditionally we call this the degree level of employment in the geosciences. That certainly historically has been very accurate. Usually oil and gas and professional services are the big dogs in this, and they weren't very big this past year. Some of that is the mining industry has been thriving. They have been very aggressive in their hiring, and we see that being expressed in this area. But one of the other things that's interesting is state governments went on a hiring binge. And, for those that follow the policy space, we recognize that most state governments have been awash in money because of pandemic support. And there seemed to be a lot of hiring across the Department of Environmental Quality, the state surveys, and similar agencies to fill in for all of the retirements that were going on. The other thing, which has been very consistent over the years and remains so, is healthcare as a consumer of master's graduates, and most of these are actually our geophysics master's grads going into the medical imaging space, and that has been a very consistent source of employment for those graduates over the years. And as I mentioned, this is just a bit of a time series. You can see here this sort of crab gut yellow is the oil and gas sector. You can see how dominant the employment was and how much that has shrunk. You see the growth of mining, and you see some constraint here in the professional services at the masters, and we'll talk about some of those shifts that are going on. So there are a lot of very fundamental changes. The diversity of destinations for our graduates is growing, but as I don't have a chart on it, but in our surveys, folks are still doing their geoscience. They're coming out in degrees. They're going into lots of different sectors and still functioning as geoscientists. And I think that's pretty exciting. So our employment spaces is diversifying at a pretty rapid rate. So the doctoral is another area of very interesting change. So there's no surprise that the universities and research institutions, federal government are big consumers of our doctoral graduates. But professional services has sort of come out of nowhere in the last couple of years, and now 16% of our doctorate recipients went to work in professional services. It was zero, and has been for a long time. So this is a sudden change, and one of the things that we believe we're seeing is the professional services sector is looking for they need skillful new employees, and through a number of this analyses we've been doing, particularly on our recent graduates, is that the skill gap between a master's and a bachelor's is pretty small compared to the big gap between a master's and a doctoral student. And so you have this really big change. And then what you see here, and this is a terrible chart, but the big thing I want to point out is professional services, and that the PhD students, graduates, they were the most likely to be seeking employment in professional services. So it's not even just that, oh, there weren't faculty positions available, but they were actually actively out seeking those jobs and landing them. And what's interesting about that is when you talk to folks in some other disciplines, the nature of what the role of the doctorate is changing. It is no longer by a lot of the students being viewed as my next step to become a faculty member or a traditional researcher, but it's a gateway into a myriad of other high skilled opportunities. And so I think we see this same kind of phenomenon going on, that degree, I'll say the utility of that degree is changing, and I think in a positive and an exciting way. One thing that we did do, so we did have support from NSF for a longitudinal study on the impacts of the pandemic on the geoscience community, and we were tracking longitudinally what people were doing. But one of the key things that we keep seeing, and we keep trying to stress to folks, is the private sector employment is a bit like a gravity well for the geosciences. That is our dominant space of employment. Academic employment and government research, is a fairly small slice actually of where geoscientists are actually working day to day. So, and I just want to point out, when we send a follow-up about the recording for today's webinar, we'll also send a list of a number of links to a bunch of the resources that we're using for this talk. So salaries is an interesting dynamic. So this is looking at the various geoscience occupations, median salaries as recorded by the federal government. This comes from BLS. And the green is basically the traditional science geoscientist space. The blues and yellows are more the engineers. No surprise that they get paid a little bit more. And these are good salaries. One of the things that we are seeing, though, is that is for the bachelor's recipients coming out, that their starting salaries are sort of a bimodal. There are a whole bunch that are quite low. And then there's a whole bunch that are competitive within the marketplace. So we don't totally know what's going on there. Some of this may be increased employment in the technician space, which, as you can see in that brown, does pay less. But that's one dynamic that we've seen. But when you start looking at masters and PhDs, they're all being paid pretty well. Traditionally, the masters in the geosciences, if you have a master's degree, you make a little bit more than the PhDs, because largely because of working for private sector versus the public sector. One of the other things too, what's that future look like? What, not just by the size, but also the where. And so when we look at using BLS data and some of the models that we have to do to find where the geo components are, what we see is the changes by industry, and finance and insurance is starting. There is actually a big push there. Geoscience is becoming more forward in being a risk assessment environment, whether for investment or insurance, but it's starting from a low end. So that growth is real, but it's not necessarily a lot of people. But what we see is what I'll call the smaller service companies that would be what the federal government calls support activities for mining, but that includes the energy sector, a whole number of areas. It's a archaic term, and that professional science and technical services space. There's a lot of growth going in this. These are above the economic growth and population growth in the U.S. That's sort of the baseline, and so that's good. These are high growth areas, but these also tend to be somewhat smaller firms. Where if you look way on the right hand side, you see mining is down, oil and gas extraction is down. Even though the applications that the folks in professional services and the support services often are in raw materials and in the energy sector, the difference is those ones on the right hand side are actually sort of the large companies, those traditional employers that we often think about. So we're seeing the shuffle of where folks are actually working. And then what are the degree levels employers are hiring? Again, just as we saw in the big tree diagram, bachelor's and master's, they are being, most employers are hiring at those levels. And then the doctorate, we see an increase over the last couple years here of the hiring of doctorates, and again, a lot of that into the professional services sector. So I know when we talk with bachelors, a lot of folks admit me that, hey, you need to go get your master's or whatever. But the reality is there are opportunities. We don't do a good job of necessarily publicly identifying them and talking about them. And that's a true we. That includes us at AGI. We also need to get better along with the rest of the community and discussing the myriad of opportunities that are available. So diversity, it is no secret. Obviously, the geosciences and all of STEM has a serious diversity challenge. And when we're talking about not just the health of the profession from having an appropriate population representation, but also just from access to human capital, we have to fix this, and we'll look at some of the data. So when we look at workforce participation by different occupations, we're in that yellow bar. Actually, geoscientists are much larger than environmental scientists, so that's mostly us. And if you look at the black line, that is the entire workforce, and all of STEM is terrible in having being representative of the of the population. And historically, the geosciences have trailed all the other STEM fields. And really, if you take out the growth that we've seen since 2016, and you consider in 1972, underrepresented populations were 2% of the geoscience workforce, we really, in that long time, made very little progress. It remains a serious challenge. I think geoscience faces, but so does all of STEM. When we dig down a little bit, though, when we look at Hispanic and Latino populations, wow, we're seeing a really big change. And in fact, hey, we're number one in STEM. Still well short of the total population percentage, but we've seen this incredible growth. And to be candid with you, I think there are two things at play. One, Hispanic enrollment in higher education has gone up, and that has lifted some of that. But I do think we have to call out some key things like the Geoforce program at the University of Texas, and it has also had a halo effect. Has been, I think, very, very effective. It tries some new strategies, and I think it is helping transform sort of the proverbial pipeline into the geosciences and building exposure in communities to what the opportunity space is. So hopefully this continues, and I think it's a positive, but there are some cautionary tales ahead on this. But when we look at Black and African American, and this is the definition that the federal government uses, geosciences is a very strange undulating pattern compared to everyone else. And when we've gone in and taken a closer look, what we think we're seeing, because a African geoscientist who rotates to the U.S. on assignment, say for an international oil company or whatever, would be counted in this space. And and when you look at some of the membership roles of some of the societies, things like that, you do see this sort of these waves of folks from other countries who would classify as Black in our categories come through based on the economic conditions in the energy sector. But that means that our African American representation is that bottom of the curve. It's awful. We have not really made the kind of progress I think all of us feel we do, and obviously we have a very, very serious problem, in engaging, with the African American population, and to get into the geosciences. And look, if we're struggling to have enough people, we have a bigger problem. If we're still basically recruiting majority out of the white population, just before the pandemic started, we were down to almost just about half of the college enrollment was white, and so we there's just a numerical necessity that we have to diversify, in addition to all the benefits that the community will reap from a better representation. So there are some serious issues that we have to look at, and how to address them. So moving on, so let's talk about the future, some of the directions that we're going. The thing I like to get people to recognize is, the current geoscience major right now is going to be that experienced practicing professional in the 2060s. So, we're already in the discipline. We're trying to support the students and the early career folks. We have to be thinking, what is our profession going to look like that far into the future? And it's more about the tools, and not necessarily, telling them the old war stories and exactly what we did. And so that's one of the key things as we look forward that I want to stress. And so I look back, 2007, I gave a talk at AGU. We were definitely already seeing the signs of the great crew change in the energy sector. The retirements of the baby boomers was starting. There was great concern about, geez, all of a sudden we're going from, it was not always easy to get a job as a geoscientist to, wow, we got this yawning gap of need. And one of the key things when you think about that, there's a certain level of economic activity that requires geoscientists. If you can't fill it, innovation is one of your key ways that's going to fill it, and that I think we felt was going to be one of those keys, and it sort of has panned out that way. But it also means I'd say the statisticians have won the race to supporting the geosciences. Because if you look at it, if you have a specific level of economic activity, there's a certain number of people that are required to do that. You can fill it in a number of ways. Geoscientists. This is not to scale, but you'll have a certain number of geoscientists. There would be substitution. These could be engineers, physicists, chemists, actuarials. Actually, replace a lot of geoscientists. But then you can also innovation, which a lot of people call efficiency or productivity. Allows one person to do more work, and that's a key catalyst in this. And if you can't meet all of that demand, then you literally forego activity. And whether it's in the resources, you may not be able to extract certain resources, or you may not be able to address hazards or other issues that geoscientists are relied upon for. So a number of years back, this issue was coming up, and the question of innovation was big. And so the mining industry went off and did a study, and they determined that 80 to 82% of the geoscientists' time was spent basically wrangling data. The energy industry did a similar study. It was 79%. And to be honest with you, every finance and others have all done it. It's the 80-20 rule that, for a knowledge worker, 80% of your time is spent just dealing with the data, not actually applying the intellectual effort. And so, there's an interesting case study. So Goldcorp back at the time started collaborating with IBM and what eventually became Watson for Natural Resources. And they said, geez, what can we do with machine learning to reduce that 80% so that our geoscientists can do more geoscience? And so was it effective? They spent a lot of money on this. And they ran some tests. They had some contrived problems. They found, oh great, there was a 35-fold decrease in solution time by using Watson than a senior geoscientist team. This was the way that they set their metric. But what was interesting is they ran into their first real world problem. The board, and if I remember right, the board wanted an analysis of the gold concentration in all their prospects in Ontario. And and they had extensive holdings, and so it took they tasked the senior geoscientist team, took 1,080 person hours to basically come up with the final result. But the reality is there was almost no geology done. That was just data management and processing of existing information. And Watson for Natural Resources generated pretty much the same report in about 14 minutes. So it struck them, okay, obviously there's a good payoff here, but it's not about replacing scientists. It's about making them better by doing what they're actually good at. And so does that mean something like machine learning is a threat, that all of a sudden you're doing your work faster? And I'd argue that a lot of traditional occupations, they are disappearing: loggers, interpreters, things like this. If it's a matter of someone taking doing an analysis that is non-extraordinary. The computers, machine learning is really good at primarily identifying very predictable things and flagging things it has no clue on. And the idea is the thing of no clue is probably of scientific interest and a specific geologic challenge. And this was what Goldcorp's vision was, is they wanted to move to what they call this augmented geoscientist. They had harder and harder and harder geologic problems. They did not intend this to replace any geologists. They needed all of them because they needed them to spend 50% or 70% of their time doing the geology, not wrangling the data. So this was basically more robust tools. You're seeing right today with the ChatGPT tool that's come out. You see this happening in the programming space because it generates pretty doggone good computer code. And this is the end of programmers. Well, the reality is no, it's replacing a lot of typing, but it should be helping people that are good in the domain areas to better develop the code to solve the actual problems, not necessarily just plowing through sort of expected processes in the code. So again, it's this augmentation. So we can worry about not having to dice the vegetables, shall we say, in prepping the meal, but rather we should be focusing more on creating a better recipe. So that it doesn't have to be a threat, but we have to evolve. And this is coming coupled at the same time that we're seeing a change in what we're seeing the expectation for the future geoscientists to look like. And we've gone from the world of all the stovepipes. We've moved into interdisciplinary collaboration. Still a lot of folks in university research that are still sort of in that kind of space. We certainly saw in industry and in a number of academic environments these integrated teams. The idea of folks from different disciplines working in a tightly coupled way. But what we're now really seeing is a push to, we want all the team members to be littered across the entire domain, but each bringing their own specialties. And so that's sort of what we're seeing is this idea, you can talk across this whole dynamic from the engineering and geology and geophysics and business issues, and you bring a certain set of additional competencies to the table. The rest of the team also then fills in some of those holes, but you all can be working symbiotically on that project. So this is sort of setting up a framework for how the education and sort of the labor market's looking. Because what you end up with is if you take a traditional view of labor classes, the idea you got these stovepipes, you got a lot of lower skill to very few high skill, blah, blah, blah. This is, it doesn't work well, but you get this middle skill area that, right now is probably the most at risk for things like machine learning. But I don't think it's a very good representation of what we see the nature of the work in geoscience evolving to. So, we'll say we have a new labor pyramid. I don't know what the right way to call it. There's no higher or lower really, but there's really sort of these two end domains. There's sort of I'd say this the cognitive geoscience activities, really just focusing on the geo problems, not so much on the data. But they're trying to solve the dynamics. All the way to the other side, where I'm going to say you have sort of the folks that are really down in the engineering, the maker, sensor, the actual solution provider on the ground, much more of an engineering, much more technologic focus, and I mean that in the broadest sense, and that this all feeds into an ecosystem that support each other. Not a lot of space for that middle skills skill area. So, but those are different sets of skill bases, and not necessarily what we have traditionally been developing. The other thing too, I'll say geoscience. We seem to be going sort of, I'll say, gig light. People are turning jobs a little bit more quickly in as far as what they're doing. Because what you see if you look at resources more broadly, and this includes obviously energy, minerals, but also water, for instance, you see the geoscience employment is less in the exploration, that upstream area, more moving downstream into the production and management and those activities. While at the same time, we're seeing the geoscience jobs moving from the major companies. They're not the big employers as much, moving down to the smaller firms. So you got this double dynamic that's going on, and so compared to, say, having a team working at a major international oil company of geoscience geologists and geophysicists, now it looks like they're all Uber drivers because they're working for these much smaller organizations doing a myriad of different tasks. And that's been one of the feedback we've heard from a lot of recent graduates, is a lot of them really like the idea that the work that they're doing is applying on a broader spectrum of geologic problems than maybe they would have had in some of the prior models that have existed for employment. So there are these other factors that are influencing the evolution of employment. Obviously, we just talked about the risk to middle skill jobs. Fixed price contracts are becoming much more in vogue. And so one of the outcomes of that is that tends to shift the risk on a contract to smaller firms, to the person being contracted with. And what that ends up doing is, in order to protect their margin, they need higher skill, higher agile workers to make sure that they can deliver within these fixed priced regimes. So this is one of those kinds of economic drivers that are driving the changes of where geoscientists work, but it's also, I think this is one of those factors that's driving the hiring of doctoral recipients. Singleton geoscientists have always been there. We have geoscientists from pretty much every single county in this country. That you have the one or two that might work for a county government in environmental protection, or works for a manufacturer or a real estate company or what have you. And they're the only person, usually in some kind of regulatory reporting position. And we're seeing a continued increase in the number of those, as companies move out and could be NEPA or any range of regulatory regimes that they end up tackling. And I think one of the other things that we continue to see, and I like to try to promote, is we need to make sure that we're solution providers. Skillfulness and innovative thinking are going to be the winning traits, and that's I think historically we're all trained very well to say, well, this is what's happening. We made the observation, we made an interpretation, this is what's happening. But we actually need to make sure that we're also moving forward, and how we engage our students in early careers to be thinking about, okay, what's that solution? It's not just a scientist versus an engineer, but we're all on this team together. Again, it's that broader thinking, and being out front and being viewed as a solution provider, not just a cost center. And so what are those kinds of skills? So make a shout out. I think the vision and change in the geosciences effort. I will send the link after this presentation to everybody. Was an NSF supported program run out of the University of Texas. We had opportunity to engage with over 1,000 of our colleagues in academia and industry and government to look at where do we need to go, and what are the skills and things that folks need. And so that report is current, and many departments are trying to implement parts of it as appropriate. But some of the key things is the core geologic understandings underpin everything, and that's a call. That curriculum you probably maybe had 20 years ago actually still pretty current, and is still valued for, again, that breadth and understanding of the, getting you to understand the Earth systems, but also not to skip on the physics and the chemistry and the biology and all these other components that, again, be able to think broadly and respond to a wide variety of problems in your work. Obviously, the ability to work quantitatively is very important. I don't I don't care what level you're looking at, whether it's K-12 or university, but the trend is in the wrong direction. And our students, this is becoming a bigger challenge. But there are big movements for, domain-focused math and programming and things like that. So solutions are out there, but we need to hunt for them. One thing that we are also continuing to market to students, especially the undergraduates, if you have a pathway to licensure in the geosciences, we encourage them to really give it a serious thought. The only thing it does is open all doors. Not having a license and licensure state potentially closes them, even though a number of industries don't need licensure. It's the kind of thing if they're coming out and they don't have a fixed path yet. But one of the challenges, and I think this is something I try to get folks that are farther down in their career to recognize, that the curriculum is full, and it is a challenge and probably unfair to today's students. But they need to focus on their co-curricular skill development to actually be prepared for the workforce. There's a bigger and bigger gap between what the degree can offer and what that workforce needs, and it's everything from things like HAZWOPER certification. I'm seeing the requirement for a drone pilot's license increasing in the number of ads, for geoscientists. These aren't hard things to get, but it takes time. Knowing how to program in Python are basically to do the data analytics and things in GIS and visualization, but to do it from an analytic standpoint. Many of our geoscience students are coming out. They may have used GIS to make maps, but not necessarily to do those spatial analyses. So these are this mix of things that we're seeing, be in demand, and we'd see a lot of efforts within the academic community to move and address these. And we see it reflected. In our COVID study, we asked the graduates, what skills do you wish you had, that you acquired in school and before you went out? And it's all the ones we've been seeing for a while, but they just got bigger. Project management, some of the business skills have always been big, but programming and more analytics and these emerging technologies and are things that they see as gaps. It's not a knock on the academic programs. These are all emerging areas, and again, it's part of that whole process for students to get prepared, and hopefully into the future we see that more integrated in curriculum. So I know many of you have probably heard much of this before, but this is one of my favorite quotes from a couple years back. With every retirement, we destroy a geoscience job. With every new hire, we're creating a geoscience job we can't even begin to describe. The new hires will define these jobs of the future. And everything that we've seen, I would have to agree wholeheartedly about that. The demand for the geoscience talent is there, but we can't use the cookie cutters and the terminology we have all used through our careers, to describe those, and to recognize that our best way to support is through understanding the science and the discipline, and that the industries and institutions are going to be evolving, and these generations are going to have an exciting time ahead. But I am very bullish about the employment prospects and the opportunities that our young folks have. But there are some key headwinds, and I think a lot of this falls to the profession itself right now, that we need to recognize and provide support to some of the systemic challenges that are facing for that robust future workforce. One that really bothers me, in our exit survey, we noticed a phenomenon. So for a number of years, our bachelor's recipients have been running at about 18-19% Hispanic, and then bang, we go right into the pandemic, and it craters. And we recognize that the Hispanic population was disproportionately impacted by COVID, but I think it also begs the question. We as a community failed to support, obviously, that's very specific population. But it also begs the question that if our masters and PhDs sort of held steady, why did the bachelor's crater? And I think this is a problem. We as a community don't necessarily reach down very well into the bachelor's level to embrace and support our undergraduate majors. I do see in other fields right now, especially in healthcare and aviation and others, they're going all the way down there to about sophomore level, and directly engaging with those majors. They're looking to try to pull them all the way through their education. So I think this is a lesson and something that we need to be concerned about, and a bit of a cultural change. Diversity remains a major issue. I sort of would make an argument, needs to be DEI should be sequenced as IED. Awful acronym, obviously. That's why we don't use it. But I think that the point is that we have to develop an inherently and obviously inclusive environment and community to even begin to address our diversity issue. I don't, I was part of a study for NASA looking at this, and to say that there are overt barriers, there don't seem to be overt barriers against accepting a diverse community, but there are cultural barriers that are a huge problem. Pedigree bias is a massive one, and that is pervasive in all the sciences, for instance, and it was something that we called out there as well. That just if everyone at sort of the top of the food chain all seem to come from the same couple places, this becomes a real problem, and it does not look accessible, and so this is a challenge that not just geo but all of the science fields do face. We are not an obviously inclusive environment. We need to focus on building the tools and processes to ensure the equity, for all folks. I still see too many people being competitive within the profession. We got too much work to do. That we should be supporting each other. We should be each other's biggest fans. We should be, rallying around each other as a community. And if we can build out a more, representative and diverse, workforce, we'll all benefit from that. But it is a matter that we have to be supportive, and shall we say, instead of circle the wagons and shoot inside, we all need to be supporting each other to expand the profession and make it strong and robust. And it's really, with those kinds of tools in place, then we may be able to actually realize this diverse geoscience community, which we need for so many different reasons. But the good news is we are seeing a new generation of action on this, and major programs that really are trying to address that inclusivity issue and those equity issues, taking new approaches. So these are just 5 of the major programs. There are others that are really actually focused on changing the culture, changing the geosciences for the better. I'm actually really excited to see 25 years in my career looking at diversity efforts, and we've been doing a lot of the same things, and this is the first sort of orthogonal approach, and I think it's exciting, and hopefully will lead to better things. But cultural change is tough, and I hope that the community will be able to take it to heart, and we don't have to just make progress one funeral at a time, but that we all recognize as we move forward the benefits and the products of these different initiatives. So one of the other things, if you may have heard the term the enrollment cliff, this is something that has obviously concerns higher ed, and obviously us looking at the supply chain of geoscience talent. Anything that might hurt the geo departments should be a concern, and the profession at large is going to need to step up to support our departments. And there are a number of factors in play. The demographics of college age students, we'll take a look at that. There's obviously been complications from the pandemic. The pathways, students are, the current generation are looking for pathways to employment, and whether it's geoscience or a lot of majors, it's really hard for a freshman, sophomore to even begin to visualize what that pathway to actual employment in that discipline looks like. And you are seeing gains, and I think it's a good thing in a lot of vocational fields, because those pathways to employment are a lot more straightforward. No one is obfuscating or embellishing the conversation. You're going to go do it. A training system, an apprenticeship, and on you go. So I think clarity is going to be something we need to be much better, particularly with early students. And we'll talk a little bit about a marketing debacle that hurts all higher ed with the loan forgiveness effort. But I want to make the key point. There's 750 roughly bachelor's granting geoscience departments in the United States. There are going to be winners and losers over the next couple years. We will lose departments. I guarantee you. And there are going to be departments that are going to thrive because they're going to figure out their value proposition and how they fit within their institution and how they can deliver for students and be viewed as a positive input to their institution. So the first thing is the curse of the demographics. Nothing you can do about this. So if you look at basically what that feedstock looks like, you can see the big surge that is the baby boomers, and each line is 1 million people in that age group, and then Gen X, that's my population. Yeah, we were the baby bust, and and that played out, and the millennials came through, and not only are there a lot more of them, but there a much higher percentage went to college, the whole 9 yards. Higher ed really was doing well. But if you look at that 15 to 19-year-old area, where almost a drop of 1 million people in that population, that's what they're calling the enrollment cliff. That's what's scaring admissions officers. There are just 1 million fewer kids entering college age coming up. Now, that's bad enough, but at least on the prior iterations, there was recovery. But as you can see, there's nothing behind there. So this is a new reality that's being faced. And the demographics is going to drive the business models, and that will impact the geo departments. I'm sure most of you who are Gen X, you remember all the big budget cuts and the other losses and austerity that we faced in higher ed. Again, there was a decrease in enrollment. It made it a lot tougher. Then you saw the millennials come through, and it fueled a binge, and it was many things. More of them went to college. There were a lot more of them, but debt was easy. And so the money flowed, and it allowed schools to focus on experiences and broadening the role of what an education institution was to these students. I mean, I think to many positive outcomes, but that leads to these big budgets, bigger overhead, and now it's a different time. And so the cuts are coming. I'm getting plenty of calls and inquiries from folks who, their universities are slashing budgets, and folks are having to defend their existence. And the key thing is we're looking at 25 years ahead of at best no growth in that enrollment. And so, whatever changes are made and now is the kind of thing that's going to last for more than a generation. And so all of these and other factors are amplifying the change in the geosciences. We hear about work-life balance. That's making major changes actually in the students' lives and the way that they conduct and they learn, but it's obviously changing the workplace as well. I know that there's lots of angst and pull and everything about return to office and not. I'll put my money on. We're never going back to pre-pandemic structures. Across the economy, there'll be some kind of different kind of work hybrid and these balance issues in this country. The other thing is we're still in the process of generational transition. So there's a lot of retirements, but I had a fair number of my colleagues in the geosciences, they died during the COVID pandemic. And one of the key differences, retirements tend to lead to a transfer of knowledge. Death doesn't. And so now it's like Swiss cheese. You got these holes in knowledge and institutions and processes, which can be good and bad. I mean, many times, you need that knowledge to propagate through, but that void may provide opportunity for some creative problem solving, but it does amplify change. Obviously, automation, we've talked about that. The utility data communications, we're here doing this online, but that does change the social dynamic. And how does that play out in the long term, especially in science and collaboration, things like that? That's to be seen. We've seen these disruptions in the consumption economy, changing in priorities on employment, by individuals. Obviously, there is a shift in the energy portfolio that's underway. Geoscience plays a big role in all sides of it. We as a discipline don't lose. We actually should see net gains, It just, where people are working, what they're going to do is going to shift and change and evolve, and that's fine. We are still saddled with a public perception that geo and the oil and gas industry are very tightly coupled. But even as that industry evolves and alternative and all the other components, bring in geoscientists, there are bigger, better ways to look at this. We have an energy industry that's writ large, not just oil and gas, and they will have different ways to play. And again, this nature of employment keeps changing as well. And as we move into smaller firms in general and the like. So it's all leading to lots of change. And I just want to call out this other one. This leads to both the DEI issue, but also, the fact that we have externalities that can complicate, when we're trying to defend our geoscience departments, which are never the biggest department on campus. This loan forgiveness, effort that sort of went nowhere. The problem was it sent a signal that higher education is not worthwhile. It was a federal bailout of customers. It looked like an SNL that had stolen customers' money and went off. It just the way it was structured did not sit well. And so, I've seen a number of studies and that support this, that a lot of first gen students are going, yeah, should I be taking on debt if suddenly the federal government thinks they have to bail people out and get this higher education? So this is a headwind against already negative demographics for higher education. And it didn't do anything to address the cost of attending college. And we are seeing, we're seeing in nursing, we're seeing in aviation and a couple other fields those industries are actually diving deep. They're engaging the students directly, and they are providing different mechanisms of support to help students afford the education they need to get into those fields. It's not going to come from the federal government. There's not going to be any major reform of college funding or anything like that, it seems. I don't think the political stomach is there, but it's something that our community needs to think about. If we do value and worry about that workforce, we may need to find ways to support our students in some ways. And then you couple it, I guess you can call it high inflation and interest rates. I don't know. To me, we're getting a fairy tale land, and it's a sort of more normal rates. But regardless, it means there's less cash for tuition. Federal loans have not been adjusted interest rate wise, but I'm sure they will eventually. And all of these are headwinds, for the ability for students to afford college moving forward. So that's another challenge. So not to end on a negative, it's just, these are things that our community can help address. But it is, I would argue, a new future for the geosciences. And, it's pretty easy to say the work of geoscience will be different. We're already seeing that transition, the what we do, the how we do it, what industries we're working in. Those are all in change right now, and it's exciting. Who does that work is going to be different. It needs to be. There aren't enough people. Are we going to have enough people? Society's problems are dynamic and challenging enough. We need a more representative and agile workforce. And the other reality is the actual occupations and the applications of geoscience are going to be different and continue evolving. The idea that there's a mining industry and oil and gas industry and the environmental industry and all these stovepipes, those are already breaking down. And I think, particularly as we head into challenges with water, hazards, climate mitigation, you name it, we're going to have roles in all of those, and we're going to have very different terms, and so we need to already be thinking and being flexible. So, I just call on our community. I try to think about it all the time for myself. What is it that I can do to support this development of robust geoscience into the future? It's been a great profession for myself. And I think for many of you, so how do we set it up, so our next generation is strong and that the discipline is strong even long after we're done. So with that, I am happy to answer questions, have a dialogue. I don't know, Leela, if you wanted to moderate out anything.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. Thanks for the great presentation. We've got a couple comments here in the chat going back. I know a lot of what you talked about was very US centric, but we have a comment here from Hayden saying it may be worth mentioning that the geoscience talent pipeline challenge, while it seems to be improving in the USA, is still very acute in other parts of the world. So can you comment on anything you've seen more globally in terms of labor supply, geoscience workforce more globally? Is it similar in where things are headed?
Yeah, no, I mean, no, it's a good point, and it is. Yeah, Europe is very constrained. They are really struggling with enrollments, within that space. The mobility of professionals is another issue. I don't have good insights into what's going on in Latin America. There are certainly some really strong schools down there, but we don't necessarily see a lot of their talent, move around the world. We don't have a lot of insights into it. China produces, a huge number of geoscientists. Their definition's a little different. But obviously they're not, really moving out and about. In many cases, they're, tasked, to working with Chinese companies, maybe in third parties, and places like Australia, they're seeing the same kinds of challenges with enough workforce. So we're all struggling. We're still sort of the 1,000-pound gorilla as far as production. We have so many departments that can. But it's the mobility. Uh, and U.S. students historically have not been very mobile. They're relatively parochial, where a lot of students from outside, if they have the ability to move around, have. And I think that's going to be one of those key questions into the future is, as we have seen folks move into smaller companies and I'll say a more agile workforce, will that agility then also start spanning borders? Again, particularly coming out of the pandemic, and we've sort of been in a retrograde from sort of a more globalized economy. So yeah, no, it is a good point. It's really tough outside of the U.S. Overall, but I do think as a profession, we have had times like 2009, 2010, 2011, where we saw actually really good mobility of professionals for a while. It can be done, but I think we actually have to think about it as a profession at large to coordinate and to work through some of the regulatory structures for that.
Great, thanks for that. We've got another question here in the chat. Looking at, we talked about all the types of training that students coming out are going to need. What about ethical training? Isn't there an increasing need for that skill within the geosciences? And how does ethics fit into that package of skills that graduating students are going to need?
That's an excellent question. The answer is absolutely yes. I mean, one of the top skills we see coming out of the raw materials industry that they want are people that can deal with social licensing. And a lot of that is about ethics and cultural awareness, and a lot of what I think the STEM field is has sort of considered I'll say soft skills, and they're not. They're a different space, and I think this is the challenge. This is one of the things that we saw lots of conversation in the development of vision and change in the various summits, is how do you integrate a lot of that? There's no space in the curriculum, but it's part of education, and we can't lose sight of that. It's not just training up on the technical, but these bigger educational components. So I think the challenge is to say that we have a long curriculum of this ethics course, this social awareness course, and cultural engagement, and et cetera. It's not going to fit within the U.S. curriculum, but I think there's a feedback loop. If you're talking your alma mater, or if you're an employer and can work with those departments, and they can look at ways to creatively integrate it into the curriculum, I think that's a key thing. And if there's awareness for the students that this is important, I think a lot of students, they like to wear the hat. I'm into science. I love the science. I want to embrace it. Why am I bothering with this, quote unquote, soft stuff, when soft stuff is often a lot harder, but that it's also valued. And we, and I think just even asking the question, you're right. You're bringing out the fact it is valued outside of our, the narrow niche, and we need to really promulgate that.
Great, thanks for that answer. I think we've got time just for one more question here, because I want to be, honor everybody's time here. But I think the next two comments kind of go to the geoscience environmental terminology. So one question is asking about what would the percentage of geoscientists who are working on environmental issues, since in that BLS chart we were looking at environmental and geoscience as an occupational category. And then we've got a follow-on question asking about some of us suspect that environmental science departments are capturing our students, and do we see any evidence of that? So can you kind of talk to that geo versus environmental aspect within occupational classifications, and then also in any trends that you see of shifting within departments on campuses for
Sure.
students?
So, secret, if you ever run into a BLS analyst and you want to get them to buy you a beer, just say you'll listen to them complain about the fact that they can't change their definitions very easily. I think there is a broad recognition. Environmental and geoscience is very broad, is a very broad brush. And there's a lot of gray zone into it. Within that space, most of it's geo. It's sort of the environmental science versus environmental studies. At the end, the environmental science kids, just like the physical geographers, are sort of doing a lot of the same stuff a lot of the geologists that are focused on geomorphic processes are doing. It's all in that domain space. And what you don't see is really particularly good employment in what I'll say in the environmental studies spaces, things that are more on the policy kinds of sides of it, unless they go off, get law degrees, things like that. So within that scope, I mean, there's a lot of gray, but a lot of it is the geology. Solid earth geology is within the geosciences is the vast majority. It's 80 some odd percent, with oceanography and atmospheric and some of the others, a much smaller percentage. There are just a lot, and that sort of dominates within that same space. But again, there's a lot of gray zones. There are plenty of geologists, people with terminal geology degrees working in environmental science. You do not necessarily see that the other way around too often, where folks coming out with environmental science degrees are working what would be traditional geology domains. Be that as it may, I think within the marketing space, you don't see, the environmental science programs, do win on the marketing. But when we look at programs, when we do our enrollment surveys and get data from joint departments, departments that offer, say, a geology or geoscience or a science degree and an environmental science degree, they get the environmental science degrees tend to have big enrollments, but they don't tend to have big graduate numbers. And a lot of them seem to move their way over into the geology side. So again, just as we're seeing demand for higher skills out of our graduates, that is not, those environmental science students are facing the same thing. And so, if they're coming in with very strong aqueous geochemistry skills or something like that, then that's great. But, what is that boundary? It's a marketing boundary at that point. So, I think the key thing is if we as a profession, if our departments, our traditional departments, can make that value proposition to the students, particularly about those employment pathways and the breadth and rigor of the education, I think then there's a lot of opportunities, to counter the environmental science marketing buzz on it.
Great, thank you. I think that brings us to the top of the hour. We do have one other question in the chat. Can I toss that your way?
Sure.
What will be the role of cognitive science in the geoscience future? So that's our last question that we've got in the chat.
Great question. I think I think that's going to be it's going to be incredibly important in defining our roles and the sort of the scope of what the jobs are. I think there, whether it's the cognitive science, and understanding the learning and the thought processes as we tackle new and different kinds of challenges and dynamics, will be exciting. But I think you can extend that to a lot of other, social sciences, human sciences as well, that are going to play bigger and bigger roles that we don't necessarily always address very well.
And that's all we have in the chat. So thanks,
Okay.
Chris,
So,
for taking the time to answer all the great questions we were getting.
yep. So we will post a recording of this presentation. We can make the slides available. I saw someone pop that up in the chat. And we will be sending along in the notice a bunch of links to things like Vision and Change and some of the other resources, so you can tap what's out there, and happy to have conversations with anyone. So appreciate your time.